Thank you. Thanks, Deb, for being my ally here today. And just thanks, everybody, for joining from wherever the planet you're joining, whether it be morning, noon, or night. Having worked across lots of time zones, I know that it might be very late for some of you. So just really thank you. And I believe our friend from Japan, who I saw his name pop up, it is very late for you. So thank you. Thanks for the organizers and for all the participants and speakers as well. I think this is a really important time to convene. We're waking up from our COVID coma of the trauma of the last year and a half and thinking about what we can do in our world. And so I hope in what I have to say today will give you some reflection, but also some homework, because that's how I roll. So I want to talk a little bit about human in open source. And so I'll be talking about matter, mode, and movement. And there's lots of links, et cetera, and examples in the slide notes. I try to do justice for my fellow humanitarian organizations who are all, and people who are all trying to work in open source. But let's talk about being human. We've had a lot of reflection on humanity and what it means to be human in the last couple of months. And reflections on how to be humble and just show up in our lives around us. And with that makes us a bit vulnerable, but also gives us a huge opportunity to say we've been in a global to local pandemic emergency around the world. It has touched all of our lives, sometimes very drastically, sometimes a bit, harsh, and sometimes just, I have to work from home, but it's still hard because it's a complex society and it's affected people in many ways. So I want to honor the fact that the humanity of who we are is actually something that brings us together, whether we're working in business or academia or in humanitarian. The second part I want to say is that let's not think of humanitarian as an institution. Let's think of it as an action. Okay. Many people, they often think about humanitarian as, it's the Red Cross, Red Crescent, it's the UN, it's Mercy, it's MSF, and they are definitely humanitarians. But I had somebody say to me many years ago, Heather, stop calling yourself a digital humanitarian. Stop calling it tech for good. Stop calling it humanitarian technology or HFOS. Why don't you just call it humanitarian? And so my ask is that while I'm talking about the human and humanitarian, also think about what does it mean to actually have change in our world. And I think that line has been solidly blurred for us in terms of what we can do in our communities and what institutions and organizations and individuals can do. And frankly, just where those gaps are. And it's quite phenomenal to kind of live through those gaps and with my colleagues in humanitarian organizations and listen to what they have to say about them. So I want to start with two solid examples of how open source in my organization and my department has had an impact. Because I think it's really important to not just talk about the theory around it, but to really just show some solid things. So I work in Solferino Academy, which is a think, do tank as part of the International Federation of the Red Cross Red Crescent Societies. We work on leadership, transformation, and innovation. And we work with 192 national societies, 13.7 million volunteers, and 500,000 staff around the world. No small network. It is a federated network, which means that much like open source communities and networks, we have to find ways to collaborate and work together across complexities. We partnered with an organization, a university called Newcastle Open Lab. And Open Lab, we've worked with them for quite a few years, and my colleague has been leading that partnership. And they created something called Climate Red, which is a platform, an open source platform on a stack. All the code and the GitHub links are listed in the chat and some of the impact stories. 10,000 people were united on this platform where we could talk about climate action last fall in multiple languages. That had a huge impact on the spirit and the agenda of many volunteers and leaders in our organization. The second story I want to tell you about how open source has had an impact in my particular group is, and again, with another university. This is Monash University and Action IT, which is in Australia. And that team created something called the Limitless Platform. And so I know platforms are platforms, but they created a custom platform on an open stack, using open principles, collaborating with our team, with their students, not as part of the curriculum, but as an adjacent to the curriculum. And they created this program, and today we announced that 500 students from 500 young people from around the world, from 64 countries, will be involved on the innovation journey. And we were able to do all of this because of open source and because of the beautiful university students and all those leaders and all the people who have better tech skills than we do. A humanitarian organization is not able to hire the best technologists in the world. We have some amazing people, we really do, but we really can't get to that scale without partners and friends like Newcastle and Monash. So To me, when we talk about open source, I thought I'd give you some clear examples. For my friends who like licenses, yes, we use MIT license. Next, please. And yes, if you want to have that conversation later, I'm happy to have that conversation. But with that, it means that I have to go to legal and have the conversation again, where I've already gotten it into, we can just have it in the licenses and in the agreements. So next, please, Deborah, if that's possible. Thank you so much. So in talking about matter, I think we all want to matter in our world. So I've talked about what it means to be human and how like, sorry to call last year raw, but it was kind of raw in different ways and different parts. So when we talk about matter, we all want to matter in our lives, in the lives of our friends and family, in the lives of our communities, and in our world. And so when we think about matter, it's a really vulnerable thing, and it's much like volunteering. And so again, I work with an organization that is really heavily focused on volunteering. But before I became and working in humanitarian space, I'd already been volunteering my whole life since I was 14 on different things, and definitely had been volunteering in open communities and open data communities, well, largely before I even walked in. And so that need for how do we build safe spaces which are inclusive, diverse, and comfortable, which allow for different skill sets, all of the same questions that you're asking in open source communities, I think we're all asking, and we're all trying to figure out how to get better at that. But as we think about that thing about giving a change in the world, we need to get better at converting it and making it possible and feasible for more people to get involved in their world. And that means institutionally, but also across all the different networks and the projects that we work on. Next, please. In that we work in very complex systems. So trying to navigate and learn the humanitarian space, I've only been involved for 11 years as a volunteer and with different organizations, and only almost 5 years inside a humanitarian organization. I still need a map. I still want to understand. And so there's a bunch of articles that I put in there to help you get a lay of what's the current state of technology and what are the theories and thoughts behind it. But I want to talk about the fact that the first experience I had working around humanitarian work was with a hackathon. And, you know, whatever you think about hackathons, sometimes it's a gateway for people to realize they can have a different kind of impact or that they can do some kind of change. And so it's a good kind of introduction lesson, if you will. At the Red Cross, Red Crescent, our friends at the Norwegian Red Cross have been working on a project called RCS. Sorry, it's called NIS. That's a different project. It's called NIS. And NIS is really about community-based surveillance, which is not this creepy security stuff, but more about how can we be an early warning system for cholera or other emergencies in the world. And so they had been doing this with the Belgian Red Cross and the Senegal Red Cross as well. They had codathons in their neighborhood in Oslo with Microsoft Norway and a bunch of tech companies and universities. This is a story that's very similar for many of you, and you probably heard it across many open projects. What's important about this is that humanitarians are not ready for the hackathons. We still aren't ready. The problem set in the discoverability and being able to kind of figure out how to work with you, we still have a lot of work to do there. But I think we want to work in a sustainable model. So how do we take that kind of building projects in a more sustainable way? So that's why I love the TideLift event. That was really fun for me because I'm like, we all need maintainers and sustainers. Even if it isn't open source, we need it all around. So during the COVID response, I received emails from the government of Estonia, the government of Switzerland saying, hi, we're running hackathons. Can you help us? What problems would you like to solve? So I sent these notes to our humanitarians who said, hi, you know, we're in the middle of an emergency. We're delivering food and blood supplies, and we are trying to source through all this information, and there's misinformation and disinformation. We are happy to work with them, but just not in the hot of emergency. So we're still there. We're still trying to figure out how do we have all these beautiful people who want to matter, who want to have an impact in their world, but still can't get into a way to figure out what the kind of roadmap is in that bridge. Next, please. Thank you. So in terms of that, we have to roll back a little bit. So when the Haiti earthquake happened, there was a report just after called Disaster 2.0. And basically in that report, a number of people, maybe one of the writers is on this call, a number of people posited that humanitarian organizations needed a digital upgrade. They needed to work better with local communities. They needed to be more local. Over the last few years, some of us have gotten involved inside of the humanitarian organizations to get a digital strategy in place. So in the last year and a half, I was part of a team who really co-led the IFRC digital strategy, which is at digital.ifrc.org, which cites open source, open data, open principles, and digital principles. That took a whole lot of heavy lifting, not just from me, but from a number of people. For institutions like the Red Cross, Red Crescent, if it's not in the strategy, we actually can't deliver or implement against it. And all the negotiation, all the conversations, the products, the services, the insights, the events, all of that leading up to getting it into the strategy is just the first basic step. And we're not alone. The UN Digital Cooperation, they have a bunch of work that they did in the last couple of years. Open source, open data is listed there. So if you look at UNICEF, MSF, WHO, and the whole litany of acronyms of the humanitarian space, many of them have been well ahead in terms of bringing open source and adding it into it. They have advocates inside their house, but what we really need to do is start thinking about what can you do as organizations, whether you're in a business or whether you're working on an open source project or a FOSS project, how are you going to take all those policies and strategies and implement it in your communities? Because the strategy is only as good as the activities afterwards, right? So it's a huge opportunity to say, we did this heavy lifting in-house, now we can start pushing towards the next stage. Next, please. So I want to get to modes. Much of all the kind of negotiation and reading all the things around bringing open source to the center and all the work that people have been doing about research and open source and business and all the advocacy, all the partnerships that everyone's been doing over the years. I've been watching and listening from you and then taking those same tactics and trying them in the humanitarian space. So keep starting those fires. And the inner source friends, I feel like in the humanitarian space, we kind of need our own version of that, or maybe just a sidebar of all of us who are trying to work inside these institutions to make the change so that we can make it open so that communities and technical communities could work better with us. So I think there's no shortage of activities that can be done there, but I think in terms of the modes, there's so much more work in terms of advocacy. But now we have to do the deep work. We have to go beyond just the products, the services, the prototypes, and get into like this and take the strategy and kind of pull it out into like, how do we kind of, if I could be so bold, invade, if you will, and kind of upscale into kind of using the open principles in a new way. Next, please. Thanks. So on principles, thanks for all the tweets about that. I'm like, okay, well, I'll try and talk a lot more about principles. What I did is put a lot of notes in there, and there's also a video that Laura Hilgiger and I did for the Open Organization, talking about principles, but also talking about the modes of work. How did we as teams of people, and again, I want to just seriously say, there are many people in my organization who are open advocates. We actually have we had a document where we put all of our talking points that we had scribbled from many open projects and said, here's the ones that work with our leaders. Here's our products and services in-house. Here's the ones that outside kind of people know about. And then we've had these shared talking points that we keep working on. So that's the kind of activity that I think from mode to principles that do it. And so when I say principles, on the one side, probably our sides are different, but underneath fundamental principles, these are the Red Cross, Red Crescent fundamental principles, which are very much aligned with humanitarian principles, except for, I just want to mention, voluntary service is very much at the core of the Red Cross, Red Crescent. So every humanitarian organization has similar principles or values, and we certainly unite in some of the kind of main activities that we do. So when it comes for principles and mapping it, this is important for all your talking points in your negotiations. So for my friends in humanitarian organizations, if you are listening, take heart. There's a bunch of us who want to help you because, boy, we've been through the special conversations, can I call them that, and the group therapy. So in terms of the principles I'd like to talk about, specifically volunteer service, collaboration, and community. So I've taken the open organization principles and mapped them to our work. And I want to give some examples around inclusivity, collaboration, and community. Those to me are really important and really kind of aligned with what I'd like to talk about today. I'd like to also mention that there's an article that's cited that I read 11 years ago from Chimintis de Silva from Sahana that talks about aligning the methods and the modes around open source to fundamental principles and humanitarian principles. I use that article for 11 years in every single conversation. I'm like, hi, look, there's been some research. What I need is more of that. So please keep, if there are researchers here, please help us with those research talking points, because those are very, very important. So it's more that if we don't have the principles mapped, we can't actually have a common language. And you know this because if you're working in business or you're having a conversation, or you're working with governments, you're already having this conversation. And so the tactics around mapping to what the values and the positions and the strategy are, that's not going to go away. And so one of my colleagues from DNV, which is a partner of ours at the Red Cross, she calls it setting little fires. She said, keep going on the insights, events, products, services, prototypes. You have to keep on that, and you're going to have to keep on it for decades. But you need to level it up in terms of the kind of whole organizational shift. So we've been walking behind the digital strategy as the Open Friends with that. We've been teaming with people like the Center for Humanitarian Data from OCHA. Gosh, that started in a hackathon. And that project is actually something that I want to get to in just a little bit, because that's an example of an open source project that works across all humanitarian actors that people can use. And I know Open Data is a friend of open source, but just hang in there with me for a second, because this is an example that we can use and point to, and we do it every day. At I4C, we have a program called, a platform called Go, which is where all of our emergency information on is. We actually have followed right behind that, and it's been very much a partnership about learning from each other. Next, please. So I talked about modes and principles and stuff. Let's go back to the people, because this really should be about people before processes, and it's always about the people, processes, and tech. And when open source, in order to be able to get it to win, we have to go back to basics. This is a community meeting in Dar es Salaam that I had the privilege to go to when I was at Phosphor-G. You'll see a Red Cross volunteer there. He's an expert in disaster response, and specifically they're working on flood resilience and flood protection. We're at a community meeting in Bugarini. The gentleman with the white shirt is a university student who has been hired and is working with Humanitarian OpenStreetMap. On the ground there, on the table there, you'll see a map. The woman in the red is the most important person in the room. She is verifying that map. She called somebody actually while I was there. I don't speak Swahili or understand it, but I understood her like pointing at the map. She verified that information. So this, to me, has to happen with every community, every idea, and every problem we want to solve. Instead of, as much as I work in Geneva and certainly think about ideas, most of my team is in Rome. Some of our team is in Beirut. We are working globally. We are working remotely like everybody else. But I think the way that open source can win is if they actually work with local communities. And so that's really my ask for you. Instead of, as much as I work for a large humanitarian organization, what I really want people to do is talk to the local humanitarian organizations. Because if you can solve a problem with them, that serves that community and build those relationships. And as you know, partnerships and relationships take decades, and trust and confidence and being able to kind of figure out what the problem set is and do the real deep listening. If we're not listening in open source with humanitarians, we're never going to meet. And they do like to talk, and they do love their meetings. And unfortunately at my organization, they love email. They love email. It's fun. So anyway, going back to this, I think community meetings themselves, there are, and I saw that earlier somebody was posting, Justin was posting about a open hub in Albania. There are hubs and labs and lugs around the world. How are they partnering? What is the map of open plus humanitarian, and where are the actions and overlaps? So that's what Humanitarian OpenStreetMap is doing right now around the world, is they're mapping some of their work to other partners and local communities and local universities. And I think that's how we kind of scale up and work to kind of the larger question. Next, please. So what I started, I want to talk about movements, but not movements per se of, an ad hoc movement, because I think those are really important, but more about the movement forward. This isn't moving fast enough, right? Technology is moving very fast. Humanitarian organizations are overwhelmed. This year has been incredible that we launched a digital strategy, got it approved by our governing board, had open source there, still working on different products and services which are open source, which is fantastic. Or that has an open source license. I don't think it has a full arc. Sometimes there's a lot of sustainability that we need to work on, but we have to be accountable for that. But excuse me, when we're talking about movement here, I'm talking about let's move this ball faster. And so I mentioned earlier about the COVID coma. So as lots of people are shifting their lives and making different decisions. And so my call to action is, hey, if you're shifting lives and shifting decisions, can you help a humanitarian, or can you be one? And when I say humanitarian, I don't mean the institution. I mean, what are you going to do in your community to make a difference? And so that doesn't always work for everybody, and that's okay, because I think every interaction is a gift. And if you mentor somebody, if you design a program, if you fund somebody, if you teach them what you know about open source and then let them fly, that's a good day. So movement has to happen between the people, and it has to work like an orchestra. And I think we're not coordinating as much. And when it comes to the movement forward, we can talk about open source every day, but if it doesn't infiltrate the humanitarian organizations at a kind of larger bit and at a local level, I think we'll kind of pause, right? So we're in meetings. I was in a meeting on Tuesday, and they were doing a product demo, and I put my hand up. I'm like, hi, is this open source? No. My colleague, because we all team, my colleague's like, hi, that's great. How will it work with GHIS1, which is a health system, which is used actually in Syria by SARC, which is the Syrian Arab Red Crescent. So we're asking about the APIs, and we're asking because ministries of health organizations use these open source systems. They also use OpenMRS, which some of you are familiar with. So we're looking at not just open, but interoperability. So if you're going to create a closed system, how will it play nice with everybody else? And so there's so many people in my organization who are every day banging the drum quietly, and teaming together. So it's fantastic. So I think they just need to meet some other people and have some allies. We're tired. Next slide. Coming back to local action, so that's about movement in terms of how we go forward, but more to how we get to there. So I've made a little bit of a call to say we need to actually think about open, not just at a global level, but as a local level, right? There are some brilliant people around the world who are making open happen every day. And I just want to give you one more example of just how the power of like a global tool like Open Data Kit or Kobo, which are built on open source, can have a huge impact in our work. Last year, because of the COVID response, we had to have a better data flow. And we also needed to have reporting on what we're doing, what needs to be done, and help decision making. Those tools became critical tools, and there was a long discussion and a long debate well before we ever hit COVID, where some people did some really heavy lifting to make sure that those tools were in place, that the servers were in place, and that they had those conversations, and there were tears and whiskey, and et cetera, et cetera. But what's important about this is that now those local communities and those local volunteers have a method and a connection to open source already across the Red Cross or Crescent, whether they know it or not. And that open source tool has helped them do what they need to do to be able to help in their communities and make a difference. So I am looking forward to seeing, and there are, again, I want to name it. I don't have an understanding of what is happening in every humanitarian organization. I can tell you about mine. I can tell you about some of the ones that my partners and friends are doing, but there's no index or guide or way to find out what software is already happening in open communities that we could build on. There's no understanding about what's needed in each of these different communities. And so those local community conversations that you have, I still feel like we need to coordinate a little bit to know how do we learn across those, and how do we not rebuild things that are already done. So the most important thing I can say about this is that when we're talking about humanitarian response, especially with the last year, we've got a good wake-up call that it's about community engagement, it's about localization. And for me, that's what technology should do. It should solve a problem for the local community. No one's a data buffet. It's really about making sure that the local communities are in charge and can make their decisions and serve something with them. And certainly many of them are doing that. Next slide. So there's something in humanitarian response called the Interagency Standing Committee. And I've watched these notes go by. I'm like, hi. And every once in a while, I'll be like, where's the Interagency Standing Committee for open source? Do we need one? Do we need another working group? Because gosh, we have meetings, and our meetings breed meetings. But this is where the power lies. Next week, the UN is having an open source and open culture event. Boy, am I excited. It's going to be group therapy for a bunch of us to just hear like official people talk about what they're going to do. But what I think we need in terms of movement is a better understanding of what's happening out there, but also the push has to come not just from inside these humanitarian organizations, but from the open networks. I think what open communities and OSI and all the different organizations that are sponsoring and friends and family that are who are in this event, You already know what a network connection does for open source. We need a networked approach for how we actually build open source in humanitarian response. There's been a bunch of organizations and things to be built that have happened and come and gone. So I'm not asking to start a new organization, but I am asking that maybe we have to think a little bit differently about how we coordinate. Going back to Newcastle and to Monash when I started today, that special relationship with them, that partnership, the fact that they're building open source, they're sustaining it, they're thinking about how they can remix it and use it for different things, but they're helping our network. I started reading about open source program offices and I thought, well, we actually need an open source program office in the I4C. Wish me luck. That's my next 5-year plan, is how to get that happen. So if you want to come play and help me do that, that'd be my dream. But maybe we don't become an open source program office. Maybe we work with people like those university students and those leaders and those professors and those brave, beautiful people who create amazing things to help connect our network. We talk with them and they become an open source program office, which helps us. I don't know if a program office is the right way to go, but we do need some structure to be able to work. And so the businesses that have that, I'm interested in thinking through how do we align and how can we learn from that and what's the different model. And I don't think every organization is going to have one model. I think UNICEF has a fantastic model that works for them and for their organization, but you can't ask organization cultures to all be the same. And so I think there's some hybrid work to do there, but I still think there's a larger collaboration besides OSPOs. Next slide, please. I know I only have 4 minutes left. I'm very attentive, I promise you, Deb, in case you're worried about time clocking. So let's talk about opening up. So the I4C global strategy for 192 national societies around the world has open mentioned in it. I know that sounds small, but the people who did that, to say they did their research, they talked to 10,000 people around the world. They had consultations, and the national societies and the volunteers around the world said that we need to be open to new partnerships, open to new ways to do things, open to new types of volunteering. And so while this is not news to any of us who've been heavily involved in humanitarian and technology, or whatever you want to call us this week, whether we're humanitarians or crisis mappers, it doesn't matter what label you want to give us. We're just a bunch of people who want to do good in our world with open. Getting in the strategy is important, but what's more important is what do we do beyond the little fires? So I've asked you to go set little fires and go work in all your local communities, and work with your humanitarian allies who would be very happy to try and figure out how to work with you. They just don't even know what that common language is yet. Some of them are very good and they're already involved. Some of them are super busy. And, they'd be lucky if they can put their head up and try and wrap their head around something new when they're saving lives. So there's a little bit of patience and kind of common language that needs to happen. I doubt that I'm the only person from a humanitarian organization that says these things. I'm more than certain that my allies at other organizations are hoping for finding better relationships and partners with universities and technology companies, and some of them are knocking it out of the park. I wish I had more examples for you right now, and that's why I want someone to go and research all of this. So take the homework. So besides the little fires, I have some big asks. So I got 3 things for you. Okay, so what are 3 things that open communities and humanitarians could do better together to move this ball forward? Because remember, I said I want a movement in terms of let's move this ship forward, and a movement in terms of whatever the space is between us and whatever that looks like. So number 1, network-centered resources. Now, network-centered resources is exactly what the Inner Source group has, what the OSPO and the To-Do list, the To-Do group has. Guidance, advocacy, mentorship, like outreachy, mentorship, programs, coordination. So I've been talking with my friends at Open Organization and Laura about we should really write all the stuff down we've just gotten battered with for the last 10 years. We should put people together in a room or online per se and try and figure out how do we write a guidance or at least tips and tricks and codify some of the stuff we've learned. So 1, how do we have network-centered resources? 2, that's about mode. And for Matter, I think the discoverability problem is a technical problem that can be solved. Now, not all software is tagged as open source, is tagged as humanitarian, but even the best bits of knowing what's out there so that we can build on it, that's something that a technical community could actually do. And the third one is, and this is really my biggest, most important one for you, is we cannot be a global world going through a pandemic who can't talk to each other. It shouldn't happen this way. if we have the thing that, and I know many open source communities are thinking about how do we collaborate, how do we translate, but if there's one thing that could actually move the ball forward in terms of open, it's getting common language, and not just common language in terms of how we work, but common language in terms of how we can actually speak with each other. I hosted a call last year where the Chinese Red Cross, the Italian Red Cross, Spanish Red Cross, and Colombian Red Cross were sharing their stories around how were they responding to the emergency. And we had some interpreters on the call, and I kind of sat back and I thought, this is the world that we need, right? That these national societies are at a critical point, and these folks are trying to do response, and it's painful to listen to what they're talking about. But what really matters is that they could talk together and they could solve together. So last slide. What I would say is start some fires, join a humanitarian organization, get involved in your community. This is a little slight update on what I've learned about open and humanitarian work. There's lots of research and lots of things to do, so I hope you get in touch. And just thanks to all my colleagues who are in these organizations, but all of you who've been kind of guiding me along in this last little while. We've got lots to do. Thanks so much. Have a good event.
Thank you so much, Heather.